Hello, I'm Jorge Gestoso. Welcome to a new program from Washington. On today's show, child poverty in the United States. Our guest, Laura Spear, Associate Director for Policy Reform and Advocacy of the Annie E. Casey Foundation. Ms. Spear, a warm welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
Ms. Spear, from this recent report, Kids Count 2015 data book, about the findings, what strikes you the most?
Well, we've been doing the Kids Count data book at the Casey Foundation since 1990, so a long time. This is our 26th report. But this year, what was most striking is that we looked at the information on how kids and families are doing in the United States from 2008 until 2013, which is basically the period of the recovery from the recession. And what we found is that, in fact, there's more children living below the poverty line in 2013 than there was in 2008. And what's especially troubling to me is that there's an increase in inequality across the country. More children in the United States are living in areas of concentrated poverty, which are neighborhoods where many people in the neighborhood have very low incomes. And what that means is that there are places where usually the schools are not the best schools. It's hard to find places that are good child care. It's not safe for children to play in those neighborhoods. And so the fact that there are more children living in those neighborhoods now than at the height of the recession is very troubling.
The figure that you mentioned is 1.7 million children now live in low-income working families today that it was in 2008. It was
right.
Today 22%, at that point 18%.
Right. Well, in 2008 there were 18% of children living below the poverty line. In 2013 there are 22% of children living below the poverty line.
As far as we know, only one of the current presidential candidates is talking openly about inequality, something that, as you mentioned, is growing the gap between rich and poor. So all the other ones are not talking about it. So why you think that if the situation is, we're talking almost 2 million kids going to poverty in 5 years, why do you think that it seems that it's not that much in the center of the debate of the country, that the gap is growing and growing and growing?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think that there's a need to have more conversation about inequality and what to do about it, because it's difficult to talk about solutions to decreasing inequality in our country. One of the things that we know has contributed to increasing inequality in our country is the fact that jobs that were created in the recovery are oftentimes jobs that don't pay well. So a parent may have had an okay job before the recession and lost that job, and they had to get a job that paid less. So it's about increasing wages for parents, and that's often a conversation that's difficult to have because that requires businesses to pay their employees more. It's also about providing better supports for parents, things like providing access to child care, help to pay for child care. In most places it's child care subsidies, and those kinds of things can make a big difference to help decrease inequality in our country.
If we're seeing, for example, another figure that even the IMF mentions, that is between 2008 and 2013, 95% of the profits of the economy went to the 1%, 90% of the population got poorer. Is the system, or the economic system, needs to be changed?
Well, there certainly needs to be some major actions taken in order to make a difference, because the path that we are on now is taking us in a path where there will be more inequality in the long run. What happened with the housing market in the United States in 2008 has made it so that rents now are much higher than they were in 2008. So more families are forced to live in neighborhoods that are less good for raising children. And so there needs to be some major changes, and we think there are lots of good solutions that government can make a difference. The problem is being able to get the public will to make those changes. It's not a matter of not knowing what solutions will make a difference. It's a matter of getting enough public will to force the decision makers and the politicians to make a change.
As an observer yourself, public will, is the media playing a role not to develop that public will in terms of bringing to the debate the very core of the problem that is inequality?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think there could be much more discussion in the media about inequality, no doubt about it. But there's actually been a lot of good media around the increase in poverty in the country, the impact of the recession on families, and the impact of racial inequality in our country has got a lot of play in the media lately, and that's a big part of this story. So I think certainly as it relates to the presidential campaigns, there's not a lot of coverage of that conversation, and the media could do more to push the presidential candidates to have those conversations. But I think there has been a lot of good discussion in the media about inequality in our country over the last 5 years, but there could always be more.
Your words, quote, millions of children, particularly African Americans, Hispanics, and American Indians, live in the precipice of poverty. Today, as the economy recovers, we see a widening gap between the living standards of many children of color and other kids. So, how worrisome is that for the future of the United States?
It's incredibly worrisome for the United States, because we know that children of color are going to be the majority of children in our country in 2018. That's 3 years from now. So it's important for us to know, to pay attention to what's going on with kids of color, because they are going to be the future leaders of our country, the future business owners, the future parents. So we can't afford to leave them behind. We can't afford to continue to keep the levels of inequality that we have in our country in the long run.
Another figure that you mentioned is 1 in 5 children remain stranded in poverty, 1 in 7 live in high poverty communities. How race and ethnic origin plays on this scenario?
Unfortunately, continues to play a big role in whether or not a child will be living in a household with a very low income, and whether or not they will live in a neighborhood of very low income. When we look at the data, we see that African American, Latino, and American Indian children in the United States are twice as likely as white children to be living in poverty, even higher rates for those living in high poverty neighborhoods. And over the last 20 or so years, we've seen the rates of children living in high poverty neighborhoods increase, and the gap around who's living in those neighborhoods has also increased. So that's important, because that impacts the resources that are going to be available to the families.
Another figure that you mentioned is the Hispanics are the most likely to live with a head of household who lacks a high school diploma.
Right.
So they're coming from families, because there is that sort of catch-22 vicious circle. They say, because they're poor, they don't study, because they don't study, they're poor, and they repeat that cycle. Mm-hmm. That happens.
Right, and because we know that there are a large number of children Latino children especially, living in households with parents who don't have a high school diploma. Many times their parents are immigrants, and they came to the country without a high school diploma, and they came to work. But what that means is that those children face greater obstacles in order to succeed in school. We know that that's true. And even though their parents are supportive of them trying to get that education, and a lot of times that's why they came to the United States to begin with, it's more difficult because they have a language barrier. If they need help with homework, it's harder for them to get that help with homework. The good news is that the rates are getting better for all groups getting high school diplomas. And when we look at second-generation immigrant children, we see that they are very likely to get their high school diploma, just as likely as any other child. So with time, we do see improvements, but this is important as it relates to parents, because if you don't have a high school diploma in the United States, it's really difficult to get a job that's going to pay enough to support a family. So that's why we track that indicator. It's important because it's about earnings in the family, and we know that that can make a big difference, and it can contribute to poverty rates also for families.
We have this professor at the University of Michigan, Deodre Bloom, and she says, where you grew up is similar to where you end up when you're an adult. That helps to perpetuate the racial segregation. Are we talking also racial segregation in this scenario?
Well, certainly there's been a lot of research that shows that social mobility, or what the likelihood that you're going to be better off than your parents, is very closely connected with where you live. And unfortunately, the history of our country has left us with a fairly racially segregated housing. Where you live is still very much connected to your race. You're much more likely to live with people who look like you in your neighborhood than not in our country. And so that there's definitely there continues to be a perpetuation of poverty generation to generation, many times very much connected to the legacy of segregation in the United States. So it's an important point.
And tell me about the case, because we're in Baltimore,
right?
And Baltimore was the scenery of a very important chapter.
Right.
Any comments on that?
Well, Baltimore is really a microcosm of the United States. This is a place where there's still a long history of racial segregation that we see playing out in Baltimore. There's been historic disinvestment in neighborhoods, and the neighborhoods where the uprising took place is an example of neighborhoods that have not had investment in many, many decades. And so on top of that, the economy is still difficult for people, and we see unemployment rates for young people at some of the highest rates ever. And that's, that combination of things created what happened here, I think, in Baltimore in the last 2 months. So it's, you can't pull it apart. It's important to keep that story interconnected. It's about a long history of disinvestment in neighborhoods and communities in our country, and the impact of the current economy is sort of it's the potential for there to be pretty difficult situations and things like the uprising that happened.
A lot of dropout kids in Baltimore? In Baltimore.
Baltimore does have a relatively high dropout rate because we are actually in the state of Maryland here. Maryland has a pretty low high school dropout rate compared to the rest of the country. But Baltimore is relatively high compared to the rest of the country.
Stephanie Hogginson, she's a research and policy director at the Children Defense Fund in Minnesota. And she says, right now, they aren't improving outcomes for children of color. We're trying to turn the dial on that. So what we're talking about, Baltimore times many times.
That's right. And she's in Minnesota, which is the state. One of the things that we do in our report is rank the states based on which states have the best outcomes for children and which states have the worst. Minnesota this year was ranked best in the country for the 16 outcomes for children that we track. But even in Minnesota, there's still gaps by race. So the racial story is still, it's important. It's something that that is not erased by having a good economy or having being ranked #1 in the country.
Tell me, what about the role, among the issues that you study, the role of family and the role of community?
Right. Super important for kids. We know that that children do as well as their families are doing, that you can't impact children without impacting their families. And equally, families do well when they live in places that are supportive to raising children. So we at the Casey Foundation are very much focused on building supportive families for children. That means that all children have parents that can help them as they grow up, and that their parents are supported in being parents, but also in being in their job as the earner in the family. So we push to have things like better supports for health insurance coverage for families, access to childcare, because childcare is very expensive especially if you have a young child, for working families, as well as access to things like the Earned Income Tax Credit. This is something that we have in the United States that provides, basically allows low-income families to keep more of what they earn. So they're able to get a tax refund at the end of the year if they meet certain criteria. And it's the biggest anti-poverty program we have in the United States, and it's something that we want to make sure is supported and in the long run.
And so healthcare plays a role too.
Absolutely, yeah. Healthcare, having access to health insurance coverage can be a big bonus to families, because if you get sick or your child gets sick, the cost of helping them get well is exorbitant. It's extremely high in the United States. And so having access to health insurance coverage that's affordable is really important for working families.
A figure that is also worrisome: 1 in 6 Americans need food assistance, 1 in 7 food stamps. That is also studied in your report?
We include some information about access to, the need to have access to food stamps and food assistance. Much of that is connected to poverty. So if you don't have money, you're going to need access to food stamps so that you can put food on the table for your families.
They will segregate in terms of the other side of the assistance. The well-off percentage of the Americans say, well, listen, here is a problem. This is a country where working hard, you live well. So basically the people who need assistance are basically lazy. They don't work enough, and assisting them, we're perpetuating that laziness, and because they don't want to get out of where they are. Are they right?
Well, I would say that if you are here in the United States and you have a job at minimum wage, there are many millions of jobs in this country that pay minimum wage.
What is the amount?
Minimum wage is at the national level about $7.50 an hour. If you work minimum wage full-time year-round, so 40 hours a week, every single, 52 weeks a year, you're not going to make enough money to go above the poverty line.
You are not.
You won't, for a family of 4.
Even though if you work.
Even if you're working full-time year-round.
Even if you're not lazy.
Even if you're working as much as you can. And we know that the problem is that more and more jobs in this country are paying very low wages. So they're in the service industry, they're in working in restaurants. Those kinds of jobs pay wages that will, no matter how, you're working as many hours as you legally can work.
For example, the fast food industry.
In the fast food industry, you won't be above the poverty line. As a parent with a child, with 2 children, let's say, and even with 2 parents, you're still not going to be above low income working full time. And then add on to that housing costs and childcare and health insurance coverage, because if you work in a fast food, you're not going to get health insurance coverage from your employer. So I think that what's important to keep in mind is that the current economy and the current jobs that are available to parents, and to people who don't have a high level of education are not going to be enough to raise children. And what's important, we want to make sure that those kids have every opportunity they have to be successful, because they're the future of our country. So it's critical to make sure that they're supported in the best ways that they can be.
So in which way your organization, your foundation can help?
Well, we think that it's important. There's a lot that we could do on our own, but we can't do anything close to what the government is able to do. So what we try to do is to impact public policy, to impact the way that government is spending the resources. We have a very rich economy here in the United States. There's a lot of money being spent by government at the federal level, at the state level. So we put our resources aimed at making sure that that money is spent in the best way to improve the lives of the most children in our country. So
what sort of hurdles or obstacle are you getting when you're trying to push the envelope and try to change the policies?
Well, a lot of that has to do with public will building, certainly. That there's more of a partisan divide in our country right now than any time in recent history. And so it's very difficult to get, especially at the federal level in Congress, it's difficult to get in Washington to get anything done. And so for us, that's certainly a hurdle. And in many, many states, it's a similar story. A lot of our work actually is not at the federal level, it's at the state level. So in state legislatures, working to make sure that state resources are being spent in the way that's most helpful for children. And there's a similar kind of partisan bickering in many, many state legislatures across the country.
Your foundation has any links to Latin America?
We have very few. However, we do have one link that we're very proud of, which is that we've been supporting La Red por los Derechos de la Infancia in Mexico, which is a group of child advocates in Mexico to do kids count in Mexico, La Infancia Cuenta en Mexico. So there's a similar report to this done in Mexico with tracking measures of well-being for children in all of the states in Mexico. And they've been doing it for about 10 years. So, and working to improve public policy in Mexico for children and families. And we've also supported there are advocates all over, child advocates all over Latin America, and many of them have been interested in doing a similar kind of work as we're doing. So we've been helping to support some work that's happened in Brazil, in Paraguay, Chile, in many countries, and several other countries in Latin America who are interested in doing data-based advocacy, is what we call it.
And on top of your head, what is the conclusion that you remember the most of that report from Kids in Mexico? What's the situation there?
Well, you know, it's changed a lot over time. When we first started working with the Mexican folks, which was about 10 years ago, they had a close relationship. They were able to get things done with the federal government. They were able to lift up some issues around things like making sure that every child had a birth certificate in the country, and improving access to early childhood and to child care in Mexico, which was a big push in the last 5 years.
But poverty?
The poverty rate over the recession, Mexico did actually better than some other places in the recession. And so the poverty rate in Mexico, it's of course, much higher than here in the United States overall. But with the recession, the Mexican economy, it wasn't as dramatic as some other places. However, what's happened now with the increase in violence in the country, that's the main takeaway from what's happening, that impacts children's lives so dramatically that it's really it's sort of taking over all of the other needs, because that's one of the most critical needs of a child, is being safe. And right now, and in the last 5 years or so, that has taken over all of the other child well-being measures that they track.
So finally, what's the next step in terms of your studies on your program?
Well, we will continue to work on the recommendations that we outline in our report. So things like helping to provide supports for working families, like the tax credits, like child care subsidies, like supporting jobs, getting access to better jobs for parents. And that's what we do every day. So that will continue to be our job. We will continue to do Kids Count. We do the Kids Count data book every year. So we will update these measures next year. We hope that we'll see better news for economic well-being for children in the United States, because the recovery, we expect to see some things improve, but there's still a long way to go. So we continue to do that work every day at the Casey Foundation and support advocates across the country who are doing similar work.
Laura Spiers, thank you very much for joining us.
I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me.